Good evening, everybody. Welcome again. I am Constantinople, Chair of the Levantine Heritage Foundation, and I think we share much of the philosophy of the Anglo-Hellenic League. We are established to advance research, education, and preservation of the arts, culture, and heritage of the diverse communities of the Levant. We were set up in 2010 following a conference in Izmir where we had a mix of academics and family descendants researching their heritage. The conference was followed by a trip to various sites, cemeteries, and we decided then that this was a tremendous opportunity to continue that interest and develop it and make a permanent collection and record of all things Levantine. So we organise a number of events a year, about 10 to 12. Some are Zoom, some are mixed, some are joint in person. We very much like in-person events because it's an opportunity to network. I think I've discovered new cousins over the years through events such as these. So I would encourage you to look at our website. We have, I think, 6 events lined up before the summer, and hot off the press this evening, I gather we have a talk on Odessa on June the 3rd. So our next event will be on, I think, March the 11th. Do look at our website. Do join us. Access is given to members free to our events and priority when there is limited space. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Philip Mansel. So Philip is a founding trustee of the Levantine Heritage Foundation and of other institutions, including the Society for Court Studies. He's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Royal Society of Literature. He's a distinguished historian and author. He's written 3 books on the Levant, which are available at the back for you to look at and buy if you are interested. Constantinople, City of the World's Desire. Levant, Splendour and Catastrophe on the Mediterranean. And lastly, Aleppo, the rise and fall of Syria's great merchant city. He's currently working on the power of courts, a new history of Europe, 1814 to 1918, from the perspective of its ruling dynasties. So this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Philip to the stage to talk about the great segment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. And I want to begin with a document you see behind me that didn't get much reference in the celebrations of Greek independence in 2021. March 1821, Istanbul. It is an encyclical or letter signed by the Patriarch, the Ecumenical Patriarch, and many bishops, and it is condemning the invasion of the Ottoman Empire from Odessa and the move for Greek independence. The Ecumenical Patriarch is condemning Greek independence. He calls Alexander Ypsilanti and Michael Switzer ungrateful son of the ungrateful and fugitive Ypsilanti. Arrogant and ambitious, vainglorious, they proclaimed the liberty of the nation, and with this slogan they led astray many of the evil and stupid people there, dispatching messengers in different parts to delude and attract to the same abyss of perdition. That is, national freedom is called an abyss of perdition. Many others of our nation. He goes on to say they're not freedom lovers but freedom haters. Traitors, haters of religion and atheists, these unscrupulous beings with their desperate measures provoke, alas, the retaliation of the benevolent and powerful empire against our fellow Christians, the benevolent and powerful empire being the Ottoman Empire. And this encyclical has in fact often been ignored. Mark Mansel, in his excellent history of the Greek War of Independence, doesn't mention it at all. And nor did Stephen Runciman in his history of the Great Church in Captivity. And he went on to emphasize that the covenant was broken. The Turks, and I quote, were no longer prepared to trust the Orthodox, and to claim that the Patriarch never protested against the Ypsilanti and his cohorts. I want to show tonight that in reality the covenant wasn't broken, and that in fact Greeks in Constantinople, despite all the traumas they went through in 1821, did recover and did in fact become servants of the Sultan again, more intimately and in some ways more powerfully than their Phanariot predecessors. I would call this, they're often called the Neo-Phanariots, I would call it could also be called the second Phanar, because Neo-Phanariot sounds like direct imitation. The second Phanar, it was a redefinition and reformation of the Phanar of the 18th century. 1821, 1822, horrors. Ambassadors went to Topkapi Palace to present their credentials through piles of Greek heads. Many hundreds or thousands were killed, not only in Constantinople, but elsewhere in the empire, including Smyrna and Salonika. But nevertheless, by the force of geography and economy, and the power of the empire, and the fact of the cities of Constantinople and Smyrna, many Greeks did in fact return, and were in fact asked to return by the Sultan from 1823. The city of Constantinople itself, I would say, became a force for cohabitation. Indeed, the Greek population rose to 236,000 by 1900, over 25% of the city, far more than before. In 1821, it seemed as if the Greek community would be annihilated. In 1890, they were strong enough to force Abdul Hamid to back down when he tried to end the privileges of the Patriarchate. In fact, the reformation of the Phanar, of the group of Greek elite families and the privileges of the Patriarchate, began very soon after the murder of the ex-patriarch, as the Ottomans always said. He had been deposed, so it wasn't the patriarch, but the ex-patriarch. This is the door of St. Peter, which has always been closed since his murder in March 1821. By June 1823, the British consul is writing that Greeks who had fled to Edessa were returning. In October 1827, the next one patriarch went formally in procession to Topkapi Palace to receive the Sultan's pardon with letters of submission from the Greeks of Thebes, Livadia, Yanina, elsewhere, and indeed Athens. 1831, Robert Walsh, the British embassy chaplain, says they are as noisy, active, and as gay as ever. Greek schools begin to be re-established. In 1834, the Patriarch again receives the privilege of direct investiture by the Sultan, whom he is permitted to address in Greek, a very rare and cherished privileges. By 1880, there were 88 Greek schools in the capital, and the Greek Patriarchate and community had a form of self-government after 1862, 14 years before the Ottoman Empire itself received a constitution. And some of these families who reproduced some of the patterns of behavior of the first Phanar were called Aristaki, Vogoridi, Carathéodori, and last but by no means least, Zarifi. I think there are some Zarifi descendants here tonight And I want them to stand in for the thousands of other Greeks who preferred to live as, quote, slaves in the Ottoman Empire rather than as free men in the Kingdom of Greece. And perhaps their story is a voyage into human psychology and the psychology of power and motivation. Many preferred deals to ideals, prosperity to poverty, imperial stability to what seemed to be national disorder. Let me begin with a group of polyglot translators who have been described by Johann Strauss, for example, and who ensured there was much more multilingualism, at least at some levels, after 1821 than before. For example, Constantine Apostolidis, he is part of the Ottoman Chamber of Translation. He accompanies Ottoman ministers, serves them as secretaries, and including two leading Grand Viziers, Ali and Fuad Pasha, and he was author of the first long-awaited Ottoman grammar for Greeks, published in 1850, Rudiments of Ottoman Grammar, and dedicated, of course, to the Sultan himself, Abdülmecid. And he is an official translator, and he's dedicated to Greeks knowing Turkish better. Dear Greek compatriots, it is a matter of regret or no little shame for us, the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, who live cheek by jowl with the Ottomans, governed by their laws, yet we remain indifferent about this language, regarding which our colleague peoples in the Empire, the Armenians, put themselves to the utmost trouble, privately and publicly, not only to the Ottoman, but also to the Arabic and Persian languages. So here is one of the keys, I think, to Greek behavior: competition with the Armenians. If you don't learn Ottoman, the Armenians will get better jobs. And another translator, Avram Maliakas from Lesbos, who taught Greek at the great Ottoman Imperial Lycée of Galatasaray, went even further. He invited his Muslim Turkish compatriots to study Greek. And he decided to do, and I quote, everything within his power to propagate as much as possible the Ottoman language, which could be the basis of unity in our country. He felt the need to strengthen unity and fraternity among the peoples of the Ottoman Empire by promoting our general language. So here are people who are almost turning their back on at least state nationalism. And there were many others. Here is Theodore Kassa, who was a famous journalist who moved between Istanbul and Paris, and he had a quadrilingual journal called Diogène, published in Constantinople in Greek, Armenian, French, and Ottoman. And he was a rebel. He was often attacked by the government, but very characteristically, he ended up in the employ of Abdülhamid in Yildiz Palace. So Greeks are beginning to be employed not just before 1821 as governors or interpreters, governors of relation, but also in the palace itself. And one of the most famous families of the 19th century, Phanar, was called Aristarchi. And Stavros Aristarchi had been the last interpreter of the Porte, who was trembling so much when the British ambassador was presenting his credentials in 1821 that he couldn't read the documents because he was sweating. He was later executed. But his son, Nicholas Aristarchi, very soon afterwards, putting the past behind him, becomes a favorite of Sultans Mahmud II and Abdülmecid, and in fact he taught some French to Abdülmecid and to his sons. And there was and he is not only an official of the empire, but great logothete of the ecumenical patriarch, the main official of the main civil official of the patriarchate. And the honors available for from serving the Ottoman Sultan were an attraction, as well as the salary and other financial advantages. And the aristocracy family received, according to Zarifi's memoirs, the unprecedented title of Prince Messieurs Miletti, Prince of the Nation of the Messiah. And this was a hereditary title, and the aristocracies as princes, they also became princes of Samos. I'll be coming to that later. And there was a famous figure, unfortunately I could not find a photograph of her, called Eurydice Aristarchi, Princess of Samos. She combined the role of the Russian spy, mistress of the British ambassador, Sir Henry Bulwer, and intimate of the harem of the Sultan. And I quote from the memoirs of Sir Henry Drummond Wolff, a woman of great charm and accomplishment, much courted by the different embassies. She must have had a lot of inside information. And she was finally expelled in 1877. Somebody should write her biography. So the aristocracies are very definitely Ottoman, and here is a great book, Législation ottomane, où recueille les lois, règlements, ordonnances et capitulations et autres documents officiels de l'Empire ottoman. Aristarchi Bey, Gregory Aristarchi Bey, who is a son of Nicholas Aristarchi. He's an Ottoman diplomat in Paris, and he said that he was so popular, he knew so many people that for 30 years he never had to eat food. So a very cosmopolitan international figure who publishes, and presumably had a role in translating, this multi-volume collection of Ottoman laws. I think the first collection published in French. And his brother was called Stavros d'Aristarchi Bey. He gets a D, and he's one of the first senators of the Ottoman Empire, appointed in 1877. And there's many stories about this family office of great logothete, and how they would use it. They would always stand beside the patriarch in great ceremonies. He would recite the Lord's Prayer. At every patriarchal election he had a special voice, and at a time when money was flowing into the Phanar, he would offer a percentage on revenues. Every time the patriarch went before the Sultan, the logothete performed the duties of interpreter. And Easter services in the Greek church of Phanar, wearing the gold uniform of his Turkish full rank, with its gold embroidery, medals, and a huge sword swinging by his side, when he came down from the throne, very small himself and quivering, took off his fez and crossed himself to read the prayers reserved only for him. I swear, this is the memoir of Zarifi, I swear that all those who saw him could hardly contain their laughter. And they considered themselves, like many others, to be the last of the Byzantines. And so they had the title of prince, and they were great rivals. Yes, I'm quoting Zarifi's memoirs. At the time when money was flowing into Phanar from the provinces, the logothete could easily demand the lion's share. And his rival was Stephanos Vegleridis, who had been first Prince of Samos, brilliantly described by Christine Filiou in her book on him, Biography of an Empire. And he is a friend of Sultan Abdulmejid. He's Prince of Samos from 1832 to 1855. And the Sultan does him the great honor of going to his house, and I believe to the local church in November 1851 for the wedding of his daughter to Ioannis Photaiadis. And he was definitely a polyglot, cosmopolitan Ottoman. He said, my goal and wish is for civilization to be fully realized in Turkey, but with the names and forms of the Muslim legal system guarding the unity of Ottomanism and of the Ottoman ethnicity. And he's pro-British. It's through Stratford de Rent's influence in part that he becomes Prince of Samos. He's always around, and his apologia has been published by Christine Filiu. The Ottomans under whom God has subjected us for our sins. Their power is such that no suspicion must be aroused. I remain steady in the duties of my servitude to avoid the massacres of many Christians. That's always unanswerable. And his family would go and see the Sultan. There's a description of meeting him. Even Abdul-Majid, who was the gentlest of them all, he's shaking as he approaches him, sitting under a large tree in the park of the Sarai in Paris. "Come near," His Majesty said, "come near and do not be afraid." But how could I go near? My whole body was shaking. I had my arms crossed behind my back, and so on. Abdul-Majid said, "Your father has served my kingdom faithfully and has been recompensed by me. If you do the same, you will receive the same recompense." So it's the language of courts down the ages. Services and rewards. Rewards and services. As one king of France said, services must always precede rewards. And I think that was the Ottoman philosophy also. And a third family after Aristarchi and Voglaridis is the great family of Musaras. Now here is one of the wonderful Greek churches built in the 19th century in Istanbul. It's just near Taksim. They're easy to miss. Hagia Triada, absolutely beautiful inside. The famous great school in Phanar, also built in the 19th century. And this is a marvelous a portrait of Yanko Mavroyenis. So this is a family linking the second Phanar to the first, because Mavroyenis is already in office before 1821. And here he is as an Ottoman diplomat in Vienna, painted by Herr Schramm. And you see another reward of Ottoman service was these medals which started multiplying. And his nephew, Spiridion Mavroyenis, was later Doctor of Abdul Hamid and Inspector General of the Medical Establishment in the Empire, and a key figure in Yildiz Palace. And here is Stefanaki Voloridis, photographed towards the end of his life. Also a very powerful figure. If the Aristarchis were said to be pro-Russian, the Voloridises were pro-British. And here was Kostaki Musaras, ambassador to London for over 30 years, which must be a record. We see he's covered in medals. And he married a daughter of Stephanos Veggeridis, and he regarded himself as most obedient and most faithful before the Sublime Porte. And his correspondence has been published by Sinan Kunurel and Gul Tokai, and it's very interesting. Of course, it's in French, the international language of the time, and the second language of many inhabitants of Constantinople. And they go on referring to the Sultans in this family correspondence in very deferential and faithful terms, even as late as 1910. Sultan Murad of blessed memory, Sultan Abdul-Majid of blessed memory, and so on. Here he is again in his Stomberine. Here he is in a caricature. And he is the guide of Sultan Abdulaziz in 1867 when he comes to London on a state visit. And there's a very grand state ball given in the Indian office, which I think had just been built. And his wife is with him, and suddenly she has a heart attack. June 1867, it was probably very hot, and she dies in the middle of the ball, which I think is the only example of a death in the middle of a court ball, anyway, that I've heard of. And the body is ushered out as the guests go on dancing. And I believe from the accounts I've read, her daughters went home. I think the ambassador stayed. His first duty was Prince Sultan. And maybe the excitement of the event and of seeing her daughter dance with the Prince of Wales was too much for the ambassadress. And this is his son, Stefano Bousaras, who became Prince of Samos and was also an Ottoman diplomat. The Principality of Samos, to a certain extent, replaced the prestige and advantages Phanarians used to derive from being princes of Wallachia or Moldavia. It's a small island on the edge of Anatolia. It had risen against the Ottomans. It did not want to be part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire did not want an island so close to Anatolia to be part of Greece. So the compromise in 1832 was that it would become an autonomous principality paying tribute to the port, like Wallachia or Moldavia. And it was a lovely job for the Phanarians in Istanbul, and they used to go to Samos. There was a ceremony of investiture, we'll come to that, and there was a Samian constitution and a national anthem of Samos. And I'd love to hear it one day. This is another famous Greek family, the Bartatsi, originally from Smyrna. They then moved to Constantinople and flourished as bankers. The other great role of the second Phanar, officials and ambassadors and interpreters in government service, but also bankers. And they founded the Banque de Constantinople in the 1850s. On the left is Hélène Bartatsi, whose daughter, Marie Vatsera, is later the mistress and a victim of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Miami. And this is the installation of Stephanos Bousaras as Prince of Samos in July 1896. You see, it's a very Ottoman occasion, Ottoman official uniforms. There are some top hats. I wonder how Samos benefited or didn't benefit under the rule of these princes, and whether anybody opposed annexation of the Kingdom of Greece in 1912. And here is Alexander Mavroyenis as Prince of Samos also. Again, you see the embroidered uniform, which cost a huge proportion of an annual salary, and many medals from many different countries. So we've had these families, and now I would like to come to the most important Greek banker of the 19th century, who was Georgios Zarifli. Here he is. He was born in Constantinople in 1810. He fled in 1821, like so many others, to Edessa. And then he comes back and he actually goes to Nauplia, to the capital of the growing young Greek state, the citadel of freedom. But he's so put off or appalled by what he sees there, the rivalries, the chaos, the poverty, the suffering, that he leaves independent Greece and goes to Constantinople. In 1864, with Bartatsi and a rally and a Jewish banker, Count Albert Comondo, he founds the Société Générale de l'Empire Ottoman. He enjoys a financial reputation, it was said, second to none in the Levant, and is beyond all question financial power, and a very generous benefactor to the Greek schools in the city. And he refused to subscribe to Greek government loans on the grounds that they might be used to attack the empire. And again in 1877-78, when Russian army is outside the gates of Constantinople, on the whole, the Greek bankers remained connected to or loyal to the Ottoman Empire, in which their financial interests were invested. And the memoirs of his grandson George, recounting his life and George's own life, are a real window onto the life of the Greeks of Constantinople. And hopefully they will find a publisher for the English translation. It's been published in Greek and Turkish, but not yet in English. And I do urge any one of you here who knows of a possible publisher to tell me. Because they describe how in the 1840s the rich Greeks leave the Phanar district of the Golden Horn and move to the more fashionable and elegant Pera district, now Beirut. And working on the financial structure of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman public debt, and the tobacco monopoly. It is said that George Zarifi financed the new tree-lined road linking Tarabya, the great summer resort of the city, to Istanbul. And in fact, the memoirs are full of stories of Tarabya, the parties, the dances, the summer embassies, and so on, which I think would interest English readers very much. He has two sisters, Sophia and Teresa, who visit the Sultan's harem at the invitation of Abdul Hamid. And their family begin to live the life of international banquets, moving between Constantinople, Marseille, and Paris. Life in Tarabya, and I quote, "A glorious summer in Tarabya, all houses and hotels full to bursting, our house never fuller, and our boat the Anemone, with its 5-man crew, much used for day trips and on-board entertaining. Many travels in Europe, many charity balls for Greek charities, and the key figure is, of course, Sultan Abdul Hamid, who ascends the throne in 1877. And George Zarifi had been clever enough to be his private banker when he was still a prince, and to advance him loans when he ran out of money, and to put his finances in order, at least according to the family memoirs. He did not know how to express his gratitude and fondness for this man who had become a kind of saviour in his eyes. From his warm feelings, he started calling him father. And despite all the disgraceful episodes of later years, Hamid never ceased calling him by that name whenever he saw him. And they used to visit each other before he became Sultan. And Mrs. Zarifi received the order of the Shefakat, one of the orders for women started by Abdul Hamid. And he remained, however, Greek, and Abdul Hamid apparently would say, "Become my subject and you will become a vizier." And Zarifi would bring foreigners or other people to the Salamnik, the great reception after Friday prayers every Friday outside Yildiz Palace, the residence of Abdul Hamid. And there's very good descriptions in the memoirs of the site was so wonderful, grand and unique that every traveller did their utmost to ensure that their embassy provided them with an invitation. The ambassadors of the great powers sat in the finest room, other diplomats in others, and the least important in more lowly rooms. And then the great chairs of Padishah ibn Chokya Shah, and Abdul Hamid would reply with a warish smile and a faint military salute. And also, they didn't respect so much Abdul Hamid's father, Sultan Abdul Majid, and there are descriptions of him lying on a mattress, senseless from alcohol, being transported in his kaib from his kiosk to his palace. All the hopes he had aroused had been drowned in wine. And the real rival for Zarifi is not the Turkish officials in Yildiz, but of course a fellow Greek. There is Zographos, who had been private banker to the Sultan's predecessor, Murad V, and another very powerful figure in the city who then left after Murad V was deposed in 1877. So Grafos had helped finance the Çiçek Passage, which I'm sure you all know, in Istanbul. And that is Yildiz Palace with the great the great mosque, Yildiz Mosque, built for Abdul Hamid by 1890, and Abdul Hamid's reign was the golden age of the second Phanar and of the Greeks in the 19th century. The architect of the Sultans Mosque was a Greek called Nicholas Sedipis. And here is the rival Greek Spiridion Mavroiannis, who is a nephew of the Mavroiannis you've seen before, and who had an office in Yildiz Palace, an office in the Sultan's Palace. He's the Sultan's doctor and Inspector General of all medical establishments. And here is Zarif's magnificent tomb in Shishli Orthodox Cemetery, showing him as a benefactor of Greek charities. And there is now a sort of cult of Ottomanism, where the hymns, Ottoman hymns for Greek schools, always in praise of the Sultans and of the Empire. And the patriarch who is most admired by Greeks in the 19th century is Joachim III. And he says, there's a story that once the Sultan sent a pineapple from his greenhouse taken by the chief Lacuna to the patriarchy as a present for Joachim III. And Joachim III actually kissed the pineapple and said he would always be faithful to the Sultan, and the Greeks would always be faithful to the Sultan. And why is there this growth of loyalty in the late 19th century? I think it's because Armenians were proving less loyal. Armenians had received Russian visitors in 1877, when I think the ecumenical patriarch had been wise enough not to. Armenians were rising in revolt in Ottoman eyes, and another new enemy was Bulgaria, which was becoming more powerful after 1878 as it set up as a semi-independent state, and the bitter enemy both of the Turks and of the Greek patriarchy. He regularly assured the Sultan, both in Greek and in Turkish, of the loyalty of the Greek nation. So there's a Greek doctor, a Greek architect, there's also a Greek minister, Alexander Karatheodori Pasha, who signs the Treaty of Berlin in 1878 for the Ottoman Empire. And there is a Greek photographer. There is Joachim III. And here is Basil Kargopoulos' carte de visite, because Abdallah Frère, the previous court photographers of the Sultan, had been dismissed as Armenians who had been disloyal during the Russian invasion of 1877-8, so they are replaced by Kargopoulou, father and son. And here are some of the wonderful photographs of, this is the gate, a gate of Dolmabahce. This is Sultan Abdulaziz, who died in 1876. And here is one of his daughters, Princess Fehme. So you see the Greek photographer is allowed to photograph the very young children of the Sultan. Princess Naime, Princess Fatma, Sheikh Ahmed Pasha, an ADC of the Sultan, with Prince Selim a grandson of the Sultan. And here is the brother, the suspected younger brother of Abdulhamid, Rashad. As a young man, he's kept very secluded outside Yildiz, but Kagoglu is allowed to photograph him. And here is the youngest brother, Vahdeddin, who later reigns as the last Sultan, Mehmed VI, from 1918 to 1922. And the Zarifis are part of court life. They are invited to dinner with the Sultan in Yildiz. And they saw how all the pashas at dinner were terrified of the Sultan, even the Caliph of Egypt, Ismail Pasha. Munir Pasha, the Grand Master of Ceremonies, serves as interpreter. He was obliged to bow very low each time he said something to the Sultan, but he suffered from asthma, so each time he bowed, he could hardly breathe. And the Sultan's meal was endless. 12 courses went by. The cuisine was mixed. Each Western plate was followed by an Eastern one with various sweetmeats between them. After coffee, the Sultan would lead guests to the Palace Theatre, which is still there in Yildiz, one of the last court theatres built in Europe. A special theatre troupe performed scenes from Rigoletto. And so, because the Sultan had an Italian theatre troupe, and the guests would leave after the performance. At their departure, countless servants were waiting at the door for tips. And then there's this moment, the closure of the churches, when the patriarch and the community, by closing their churches, forced the Sultan to re-establish the privileges of the patriarchate. And I think that shows how intertwined the communities were. That it appears to be necessary for the life of Constantinople. The Greek churches should remain open. Zarifi talks about the fanatical loyalty of the people to the patriarch, Joachim III. So, the Armenian massacres are, of course, roundly condemned by Zarifi in his memoirs, but there's no equivalent, as far as I know, at that time for the Greeks. And in fact, they are more and more part of the hierarchy of the empire. For example, Yanko Bey Ioannidis, the architect who would help build the mosque at Yildiz, is made a lieutenant general. And there are many other Greeks who were given high rank in the Turkish army or navy. Among others, I could mention Zoiros Pasha, Cosmas Pasha, Lembiti Pasha, Makridis Pasha, Constantinidis Pasha. Every Easter, these gentlemen wore their most formal uniforms, went to Phanar, and looked like a military parade around the patriarch. And this is one of the hymns that Greek schools would sing, hymns to the Sultan. O God, our protector, make the sublime port radiant with the glory of kingship. May the Sultan Abdulmejid, our Lord, the refuge of the world, live 1,000 years. Indeed, at this time, some Greeks are worried that some Greeks of Constantinople may be losing their nationalistic zeal. Yon Dragounis, for example, complained of the lack of interest from the city's Greeks, some of whom sent their children to Catholic schools. We are losing the city completely. And there's a letter about the women of Syros, quoted by Richard Clogg in 1875. An official lamented to the Demon of Hermopolis. So many women, Greek women, were going to work in Constantinople that he feared moral degradation, religious persecution, the loss of all feeling of nationality and dignity, and indeed the danger of total catastrophe. That is, the national state speaking, terrified that some Greeks might not follow its policies. So the key break is, of course, 1918. defeat of the Ottoman army, the Greek advance into Macedonia, and almost all the islands of the Aegean. That is when Greeks began to really turn their back on the Ottoman Empire even more than before, and later, as we all know, the dream of a greater Greece on 5 seas and 3 continents. But I'd like to conclude by suggesting that the story of the Second Phanar is part of the story of the 19th century. So often it is presented as a century of nationalism, of new nations, of revolutions. But in fact, multinational empires did survive. The Greeks of Constantinople are not alone in serving a fairly alien state. For example, the Poles remained divided between Germany, Austria, and Russia. Some served Prussia, even Prussia. Bismarck even suggested that, and I quote, the Prussian state incorporated new Polish subjects just as readily as Germans, if not more so. Some Germans really detested Prussia. In Britain, many Irish Catholics continued to serve the United Kingdom. The monarchy was even quite popular in the early 20th century. If you look at surviving films of visits of Edward VII or George V, at times a third of the British army was made up of Irish Catholics. And some Irish Catholics officials rose high in British service. For example, there was a Polish German ambassador in Istanbul, Prince Radulin, 1879-84. There was also an Irish Catholic British ambassador in Istanbul, Sir Nicholas O'Connor, 1898-1908. Perhaps their double identity made their governments think they would do better in Istanbul, a city of multiple identities. And so I would like to suggest that not every nationality conquered all hearts and minds. Not all were convinced by nationalism. I hope I have shown that the translators, princes and pashas of the Second Phanar are an enduring example of 19th century cosmopolitan elites and the persistent magnetism of empires in general